Sage Wanderer here, and welcome to Coffee Talk! Okay, so I could rename this series Titor Talk, or Titor Time, because Titor ends up in our Coffee Talk so much. And the only reason is because it's increasingly clear to me that somehow this mysterious individual from our past was able to predict almost to a T the current events that are going down before our very eyes. And I keep going back to Titor because it's astonishing to me. But in the past, when we've talked about this, I think that, I don't know that even though I'm a time traveler connoisseur, that I fully understood the Titor story. And the last couple of times I talked about him, a few times ago, I went back and I tried to find some of the videos that I'd originally looked at that gave me the information that I used to make those videos. Because, you know, I don't research every one. I went back, I learned the topic, and now I talk about it. When I went back to brush up, those videos were gone. And so I had to either decide to not brush up and kind of go on, you know, some memories that were starting to fade, or I needed to find some more information. So I dug deeper into the Titor timeline story. And so here's some points, some finer details on this, and also how it affects our current situation as far as using Titor as a predictor. And it also, the things that I studied also will, they will, hang on, I gotta have some coffee. Gotta have some coffee for this. Take a drink. I think some of the stuff that people use to debunk him will melt away when I finish telling you what I've uncovered and discovered in a deeper search. You know, they tried to... The reason I couldn't find the videos is that the channels that had put them up had been purged in all of this purging of YouTube, and so with them goes useful information. So they must have said something, crossed somebody, and they threw the baby out with the bathwater instead of just taking the offensive video down. They decided the whole channels were offensive, and they disappeared them, along with some of this really priceless information, you know, for someone like me. And so, but on the bright side, it forced me to go deeper down the rabbit hole and dig a little deeper and to go over every possible thing I could find and to leave YouTube to do it on the Titor story. Now, another reason why a lot of people are confused and dismissive of Titor is that they misunderstand the facts because there's so much false information about Titor. There's a couple of guys who claimed to be Titor and tried to cash in on the Titor timeline ideology and claimed that they were him. And there's been a lot of debunking done on Titor based on these fake Titors. You know, anytime there's a lot of confusion around something, it's because people are sowing confusion intentionally to distract you away from something that's right before your eyes, right? So if you want to discredit Titor, then you get a couple of guys, give them some money, and you go, hey, go out there and become Titor and confuse the heck out of everybody. Discredit this guy by muddying the waters. So when you sift through all of that, and it's not easy, because that stuff survived the internet. Isn't that interesting? They survived the purge. Where some of the great investigative videos out there on this subject were disappeared. But there's still a few. And anyway, so when I went back through it, I realized that Titor himself said that he had affected the timeline and that his past was not actually our past, because by coming back and making himself known, he caused a timeline to break off from the original timeline and start a parallel timeline. So from the point he came back, our pasts are identical. But from that point forward, his past that he came from, so it would be hard for him or impossible for him to get back to his timeline because he changed the timeline, and that is one of the paradoxes of time travel. But apparently, his time machine has a homing device, essentially. So no matter how many of these parallel timelines he projects and creates through his actions, he still bounces back to his original timeline. And therefore, the things that he changed do not affect his timeline. His timeline is still rolling straight forward, his original timeline. But he created a new timeline that you and I are now in. And what did he do to create the timeline? We'll just call it the new branch of the timeline, our timeline. How many times can I say timeline? Timeline, timeline, timeline. Drink your coffee. So how many times? What did he change, rather? So how many times can I say that? What did he change? He went back and helped his parents because in his timeline, Y2K, if you remember what Y2K was, it was a potential computer glitch that everyone was afraid was going to cause the apocalypse and the end of the world, and EMP level shutdown of everything. You're just driving and your car quits, because it's got a computer. Anything with a computer chip in it was supposed to fail. I mean, I prepped up. I did. I was a young father with a house full of little kids, and I prepped up big time. And at that time, I had parents and sisters and their kids, and everybody relying on me. I was about the only male besides the old Marine, and he had already had some strokes by then. He wasn't quite operating at full function. So it was a big deal for me, but they created patches, and a lot of people fixed it, and then it just turned out to be a nothing burger. Well, Titor claimed that was him that did that. That in the original timeline, Y2K was a horrible disaster, and everything that they were afraid was going to happen did happen in Titor's original timeline. And so he wanted to help his parents so they wouldn't have to go through that. So he kind of broke the rules, contacted his family, was living with his family, and this is the paradox thing. He blew that out of the water too, because he claimed that the baby that his parents had that was a toddler was him, that he was basically helping to babysit and raise himself as a toddler, as a time-traveling soldier from the future, come back in time to help his parents. And he helped them relocate and equip and get ready for that's what he wanted to do, was just to help them. But what he ended up doing was telling just the right people about the problem of Y2K, and the computer nerds got wind of it, and they went, holy crud, he's right, and they fixed it. And that's Titor's story, and he's sticking to it. But what's interesting is, in Titor's original timeline, when he comes back to 2000, right? Or 2000 is when he departs right before 9/11. Okay, and I think in 2001 is when he claims to go back to the future. Okay, and so in his timeline there was no 9/11, and there was no Gulf and Iraq War. Okay, there was no Iraq-Afghanistan war. This 20-year war of attrition. It'll go down, honestly, as one of the biggest military failures in the history of military ops. And the only reason is because there was no end game. There was no out plan. It was just a plan to occupy indefinitely, and you can't do that to people. They won't have it. It's called colonialism, and many people have fought wars to try to stop it, including us. We are a country because we fought against colonialism and freed ourselves. So you can't occupy people, not for that extended period of time. Old men knew this. It's why we got out of Japan and gave them their freedom after World War II. And it's why we let Germany reunify and all of that. So anyway, so there was no Iraq-Afghanistan war in Titor's original timeline before he fixed Y2K. All right? So he didn't have a 9/11. And it's really interesting to me because there's a theory amongst time traveler aficionados, as it were, that fate is always trying to reset itself. It's kind of what's behind, I think the movie is Final Destiny. But it's the idea that once fate sets itself, that everything you do to stop it just pushes it off a little bit. Fate's going to get you, and you really aren't the master of your fate. That there is a destination that you're going to get to the easy way or the hard way, right? And so, at any rate, I digress. Let's get back to the timeline. I lost my train of thought. I do that sometimes. I get too deep down a bunny trail. But at any rate, in his version of the timeline, there was no 9/11 because fate was trying, there it is, fate was trying to push a disaster on the American people. So we didn't get it in Y2K, and we got it in the form of a war instead. So in Titor's timeline, the rebels barely hang on, and they fight the imperialists. And at this point, from the story forward, it appears that fate has resurfaced itself. And despite all the changes in the timeline caused by him fixing Y2K, we are going right down the Civil War rabbit hole because that's where fate wants us to go. That's one theory. I believe in God, and so I don't know how all of this fits into that. And that's why this is a coffee talk, because it's for stuff I don't believe in, but I find interesting. This stuff is worth studying just because it could potentially prove time travel. It is, to a degree, proving it to me, and I've got to weave that into what I know about God, Christianity, and make it all fit. It gives me a reason to live. I got something to do, something to put the big brain under here to work for. Something to get it to cook and chew on while I'm doing everything else. So, fate is making this timeline relive the other timeline about 10 years late. So we're about 10 years later than when he said the war happened in his timeline. So that proves that we're on a different timeline. That's what people use to disprove him. They're like, well, we should have had this war, should have kicked off in 2000 something, 2002 or something. We're 20 years behind or 10 years off or whatever your calculation is. And but the thing is, when you're on an alternate timeline, it's not going to be the same as Titor. But because there's that idea that fate is always trying to return it to a normal, always trying to reunite the two skewed timelines, right? That we'll pull them both to the center and create a new timeline if we have to. That this river of events is destined to go down one way or the other. So, but the thing is, it's going to be slightly different. And in this alternate future, I could see it going differently than Titor. So let's recap what Titor said would happen, or what happened in Titor's timeline. And like I said, this would have been something that happened years ago, in lieu of the 9/11 and the war in the Gulf. So in his timeline, the 2000 election went south like our 2021 went south. And we know that it did go south, but it didn't get resolved in his timeline. It did, but it left people really upset. Like, it dragged on a little longer in his timeline as well. So he doesn't know how he changed that, but that was a little different. But the Y2K thing, well, that's it. By the time the 2000 elections happened, we were in the middle, in his timeline, of this Y2K disaster. And so that's why that caused us to have a war about 2004 or 2005. I should have made notes, but his timeline doesn't matter so much at this point because we're obviously not on his timeline. We're on a skewed timeline because of him. Theoretically, in the time traveler world, okay? So, we've got his timeline, and now we have this skewed timeline. And where it could turn out different is in his timeline, the rebels barely held on. They had a really hard time with the Federalists. There was an election in his timeline. The fraudulent election was in 2004. So people weren't happy with 2000 because they're in the middle of Y2K. So it's kind of almost parallel to now, because instead of the Y2K disaster happening just before the election, in that timeline, in our timeline, we've got the COVID thing happening just before the 2020 election. And in his timeline, you had the Y2K disaster happening right before the 2004 election. And in the 2004 election is when they believed that a fix was in, that they used the fact that they were recovering from this disaster to cause a rigged election. And a bogus president was elected. And everyone said what they're saying now about this president is, did you vote for him? Do you know anybody that voted? I didn't vote for him. Did you vote for him? Nobody voted for this guy. Nobody came to his rallies. This is almost an exact quote of the 2004 election from the John Titor papers. Okay? John Titor said, and I quote from this, that people looked around and went, who voted for this guy? And they looked at his rallies and no one showed up, and there was no low energy, and no one seemed to be behind him, and he didn't have any endorsements. and nobody liked him. And the other guy had all this charisma and everything. And then, but so everyone was shocked that this guy who was, almost unfit for office was elected, and nobody would accept him as president. Okay, and so it's kind of where we find ourselves. And in Titor's timeline, it caused a rebellion amongst the states, and the country people and the city people had a great divide between them. The people that lived in urban cultures saw country people as terrorists against the state because they wouldn't turn in their guns, because they wouldn't kowtow to globalism, because they wouldn't be bullied, right? And not just Southern, but country. And it caused states to split. And all this stuff is from his timeline, and it looks like those things are set up because that may be fate, that the United States becomes ununited and ends up being, in Titor's timeline, there's, I think he said there's 6 presidents. I should have took notes. Like I said, his timeline doesn't matter so much because it's an alternate timeline from ours, but there's this fate thing trying to push us back. And it sounded to me like it was divided up almost like FEMA zones, and you had these presidents over regions. And the main capital had been moved in his timeline to Nebraska, okay? Now, the thing is, in Titor's timeline, when the war drags on and it starts to look like the imperialists in the cities, if you think Hunger Games, use the technology, the power, and the money that they have to destroy the country rebellion and drive us into servanthood. And it just looked like we were barely hanging on and they were going to win and we were going to have to surrender, when Russia and China and India break into this global world war that springs up out of nowhere while we're in the middle of ours, okay? And Russia sees that China is involved in our civil war on the side of the city imperialists, okay? And so the Russian government makes a decision to use tactical nuclear weapons against the United States, who's already crippled and almost governmentless, right? We've got city-states and open warfare, and we got militias ruling every area that's not inside the cities, right? And you've got federal troops, and you've got bombing raids and napalm being dropped on our forests and all kinds of this stuff happening. And it looks like we're about to lose to them when this other outside conflict causes Russia to look at America and go, look, if China ends up conquering America, we'll never beat them. America, strategically, because it's almost a peninsula or an island, that we have oceans on 3 of our 4 sides, essentially, it makes America very highly defendable. Australia is exceptionally defendable as well. That's why in Titor's timeline, Australia seems to have survived the war with China, because that's the main thing, is that when China, when this thing kicks out, China invades Australia or tries to, and they have a big fight down there, and that's a part of what causes Russia to go, look, if China keeps being imperialistic, we're next. And so Russia just decides to preemptively strike them. And so they nuked the heck out of China. And they go ahead and nuke the major cities in the United States where these pro-Chinese people are supported by the Chinese government, and where there's Chinese troops on the ground at this point in the Civil War fighting. That's one of the reasons why the country people lose. The Chinese come in and start supporting the city-states, the blue city-states. And this is all from Titor's timeline. And then the president of Russia makes the decision and uses low-yield tactical nuclear weapons to destroy the cities without destroying the environment. And then that's Titor's timeline. And now the thing is, in Titor's timeline, he didn't have 20 years almost of open warfare, creating an entire generation of blooded veterans. The men that came back from World War II, who survived it and came home, they built a new nation. The inner fortitude it took to survive, the things that they learned over there, from Eisenhower to Audie Murphy, okay, these men, and John F. Kennedy was one of them as well. These men restructured our country and created a new empire, essentially. And now they did it politically. because we were all united coming out of World War II, and those men were seen as heroes, right? But then you look at another war in Vietnam where we didn't do so good, and we had a counter-revolutionary, communist-led counter-revolutionary movement in the country in the 1960s, right? Which are the people that are behind what's happening now to our country that are selling us out to the communists. Okay, these people were always communist. They've been communists. They breed more communists. They convert people to communism, and that's what we're up against. We're up against communists, okay, and rhinos who are paid off to open the door and let the communists in, okay, and protect them while the whole time they're pretending to be on our side, and that's kind of behind what the black pill movement is. But anyway, back to our story. Get some coffee. It's still early here. It's barely 8 o'clock. It is my last cup of coffee for the morning, I think. Yep. No, I got one left over in the coffee pot. A warm up before I'm done. So the main difference between our timeline and Titor's timeline that will affect the way it comes out. I think in the very end, it's going to end the same because you've got that river of I don't know, you could call it fate, destiny, God's will. And so I think the splintering of America is inevitable. That's a big thing that, that if we have this tangent timeline, right, that's going to be constantly pulling us back to Titor's timeline. This fate's going to keep trying to drive us back to Titor's timeline. And we're going to keep trying to go back there. And the separation of the United States into regions and having many presidents is, instead of just one centralized federal government, is very much a huge event that fate would want to push us back towards. So, but I think the war is going to turn out very different and be a very different war than the war that Titor described. Because we have 20 years of blooded veterans who came back from the sandbox, who have high-level skills and equipment and ability. Our timeline is going to be different because in this timeline, there are way more guns, way more people that know how to use them on both sides. There's been 20 more years of development of firearms and what's the word I'm looking for? Accessories. Training has been upped, right? They didn't really have, things. There's certain things that we have now. I won't name them. I don't want to get in trouble with the overlords in 1984 here. Make 1984 fiction again, please. So I won't talk about the substances, but there are things available to people who want to cause mayhem now that weren't around 10, 15, 20 years ago. Not to mention this porthole I'm talking to you about, talking to you through. People don't like it when I say porthole. It's just the way I say portal. It's just portal. I don't know. It sounds like porthole. Anyway, it is a hole in the port. So anyway, we are going to have a different war because we have a lot more veterans. And, I won't talk about current events, but you're starting to see the veterans who have spent 20, and these are the bearded, tatted guys in, with the body armor at the protests. A lot of these guys are from the sandbox, okay? These were special forces, guys who hunted people for a living. Let that sink in for a minute. Most of the guys who went over there who were special forces were tasked with finding the terrorists and taking out the leadership. And so these guys are bounty hunter killers of the highest sort. And they're highly trained and capable. And although many of them from their generation didn't have daddies at home and were raised by women, once they put them in there in the real men's service, they got the drill instructor became their daddy. And they got growed up into being real men. And we produced an entire generation of real men through the military who were over there tasked with hunting down those people responsible for 9/11. I don't want to get into conspiracy. One conspiracy at a time, okay? We're talking about Titor on Coffee Talk. So don't go down the rabbit hole over there on the 911, know what I mean? Well, I'm almost out of coffee, so let's cap this thing off. It appears to me more than ever that we are on a parallel timeline that very much resembles Titor's future, or his present, our future, that got changed when he came back in time and stopped us from having a disaster on the Y2K computer meltdown. And instead, we got a 9/11, and we got 20 more years before the Civil War broke out, roughly. Depends on when you say the start of it was then, and on that timeline and this one. But it was long enough to produce a whole generation of tough as steel. Yeah, I'm stroking you guys a little bit because I'm old and crusty, and if we're going to survive this thing, we're going to need you boys. And I'm glad Uncle Sam trained you, and I'm glad you came back, patriots, because that's something that they were still doing to recruits, is impatriating them. And I won't say indoctrinating them, waking them up to the beautiful potential of our amazing country. And that's why I say, God save our republic, because this experiment in constitutional republicanism has been a huge success and has made the world a better place. And unfortunately, all good things must come to an end at some point. And to think that this fine nation would carry on forever is it's a bit fantastic to think. It's a bit of fantasy involved there. You know, I mean, a realist who looks at history knows that not even the Roman Empire lasted forever, and no government run by the people and for the people has ever survived more than a couple hundred years. So we're setting records now with having the most successful version of self-governance ever invented. And that's the big problem. That's the thing that's going to cause us to have a conflict. It's the thing that may break our country apart and bring all of these awful things that I've kind of predicted to the future for us. You know, it's just the fact that there are people who don't want us to have self-governance. And if you look at the authoritative people associated with this lockdown, associated with gun grabs, associated with what happened here recently on January 6th, not what happened, but the reaction to it and the overreaction to it and the categorization of millions of Americans as criminal and seditious, right? That kind of authoritative rules for thee but not for me, do it because I said so, looking at themselves as better than us, forcing us into subservience to take a knee and bow down to them. This is all earmarks of tyranny. And so, you know, that may be the force that keeps driving us back towards this separation. So I hope our republic gets preserved. That's been my wish all along. But after this last round of election, you know what? I don't think that there's any way out of this. That destiny is going to push us towards de-unifying the Union and creating a different kind of a regional United States with areas that have their own laws and rules and really no central constitution that necessarily binds us. And you might have to have a passport to cross the continent in the future, if Titor is right. Of course, in his world, everybody rode bicycles, and cars were only special people had vehicles because of all of the nuclear fallout. But maybe, just maybe, because of that 20 years of struggle in the Middle East and the veterans that it produced, maybe they will save us from the nuclear holocaust that's coming. And just maybe we'll have a different, better future than Titor's timeline. Because one of the things that is ghastly about Titor's timeline is the sheer number of human loss, of human death, of the loss of human life in his timeline is unacceptable to me. And in fact, they did through Titor's timeline. The end result is they ran us back to the Georgia Guidestone's level of population. The 90% of the people in the world were killed in Titor's timeline, and I would like to avoid that. And maybe our baptized boys in the military who went over there and learned so much fighting them terrorists can bring that back here and help us defend ourselves against the terror in our own nation. All right, we'll see you next time on Coffee Talk.